Welcome to the ProSocial Workers podcast, the place where social work meets diversity, dialogue, and ethical practice. Here we offer courses that promote viewpoint and political diversity while fostering human connection. And the best part? Our content is completely free to access. For professional social workers and interested others, we provide the option to earn continuing education credits with a simple fee after listening to our episodes. Go to prosocialworkers.com to learn more. Together, we'll explore how to truly put the social back into social work. So tune in, get inspired, and join us on this journey towards a more inclusive and connected future.
Welcome to the ProSocial podcast. Today, I have with me Dr. Nafees Alam, and I will invite him to introduce himself in a moment. My name is Matthew Watson. I am a licensed clinical social worker and the host of the ProSocial podcast. We are part of ProSocial Workers, or an affiliate of the Institute for Liberal Values. And we encourage and promote viewpoint and political diversity in social work education and social work practice. Today, we're privileged to have Nafees Alam with us. And Dr. Alam has some shared experience and shared interests in promoting social work, viewpoint, and political diversity. And so I will have him introduce himself and then provide a presentation for us. We look forward to hearing from you.
So,
Dr. Alam.
My name is Nafees, and first of all, it's an honor to be here. I really appreciate this opportunity. I am a social work professor. I have been so for just almost a decade now, and I am someone who dearly values viewpoint diversity as well. So I'm especially honored for our friendship and all of the friendships that I've made as a result of some of the presentations and some of the conversations that we've had. So with that, I'll get started with my presentation. I'll share my screen here. All right. So my presentation is on ideological diversity and inclusion in higher education. So I'll get started. In the NASW Code of Ethics, the concept of political belief is already written in. So I'll start with several examples of how political belief and political perspectives are already baked into the NASW Code of Ethics. Now, it's important to note that the NASW Code of Ethics is very clear on the fact that these are the Code of Ethics, but there are no clear directions of how to apply those ethics. So there is a deal of subjectivity when it comes to the application of the Code of Ethics. That being said, there is no subjectivity to the fact that indeed political belief is included. As you can see in 1.05, cultural competence, political belief there's an arrow just underneath it. It says social workers should obtain education about and demonstrate understanding of the nature of social diversity and oppression with respect to race, ethnicity, national origin, color of skin, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration status, and mental or physical ability. You'll see that this comes up in other places as well. I'm not going to read through all the slides, certainly. I will pause on these so listeners and those viewers can see this as well. It's included in cultural competence 1.05. It's included in conflicts of interest. Social workers should not take unfair advantage of any professional relationship or exploit others to further their personal, religious, political, or business interests. This is actually written into the Code of Ethics. We see here as well with 2.01, respect, social workers' ethical responsibilities to colleagues. Political belief is also included there. From a discrimination standpoint, this will be important to read as well. Social workers should not practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with any form of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration status, or mental or physical ability. So that's also written in 4.02. And we see it in other places as well. Social workers' ethical responsibilities to the broader society. The word political is present in 4 places within this subcategory. So to suggest that political diversity and political belief is not included in the NASW Code of Ethics, it's just incorrect. However, what would be correct is if someone were to say, well, there are no clear indications of how to apply those the Code of Ethics related to political diversity, political beliefs, and that essentially would be right, because the NASW creates a space and creates an opening stating that there are no guidelines necessarily of how to apply those code of ethics. So this way there is some level of subjectivity there. And so this brings me to the concept of viewpoint diversity in social work education. Can we empathize with our quote unquote enemies? One author wants us to try. So this has been written about for quite a long time now. And we see that based on data, 62% of Americans say they have political views that they are afraid to share. This is back in 2020. 50% of strong liberals support the firing of Trump donors. 36% of strong conservatives support the firing of Biden donors. And 32% are worried about missing out on job opportunities because of their political opinions. This doesn't quite sound like political acceptance and political inclusion or political diversity, right? So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it seems that political diversity, political equity, and political inclusion is not factored in. And while the NASW may leave room for that, I think it's about time where we start including viewpoint diversity in the categories of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the color of our skin does not indicate the content of our characters, as Martin Luther King had once said, or I paraphrase, I should say. So data shows that staunch liberals stand out as the only group who feels they can share their political opinions. This is an agree or disagree question. The question is, or rather, the statement is, the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive. So you see strong liberals are of that opinion of 42% agreement of that statement, and then strong conservatives are at 77%. So ultimately, they feel like they're not able to share their opinions. Strong conservatives believe that they're not able to share their opinions as much as strong liberals. And this is just the same data shown in sort of a different sort of chart here, right? So again, more Americans have opinions they're afraid to share in 2020 than in 2017, and it shows the differences between 2017 and 2020. Now, assumption can be made that between 2020 and 2024, 2025, things have gotten better, things have gotten worse. We don't know. We don't, or at least I don't have that data, but it could be fair to assume that it's even more of a contentious environment today than it was back in 2020. And so more of a breakdown here. Significant share of Americans support firing Trump or Biden donors. Would you support or oppose firing a business executive from their job if they became known that they privately donated money to the following? So among all, 31% believe that Trump donors should be fired. Among all, 22% believe that Biden donors should be fired. And now when we break it down among strong liberals and strong conservatives, 50% of strong liberals believe that Trump donors should be fired. 36% of strong conservatives believe that Biden donors should be fired. This is a good time to pause and acknowledge the fact that this is not a one-sided conversation, and that both these parties, strong liberals and strong conservatives, still have the opinion that opposing viewpoints should essentially be canceled or at least be penalized through firing someone. And so the difference between 50 and 36, that does exist. Nevertheless, we have to wonder, why does even 36 exist? Why is it that we're so threatened by ideas that differ from our own that we want anyone who has those ideas fired? It's an interesting conversation, and I think it sort of indicates where we are as a nation, in that we're afraid to be challenged. We're afraid to be pushed. And so 32% worry that they could miss out on job opportunities or get fired if their political views became known. That's a good amount of people. It's 1 out of 3, every 3 people, or just about every 3 people that you meet. They're afraid because they don't want to share their political views, because if they were known, then they could get fired. Now, this isn't just Republicans conservatives or liberals necessarily, but this is everyone collectively. It seems that a third of the entire population in the United States are afraid to share their political views out of fear of being fired. So this level of self-censorship is coming into play in different areas. Here we see the academic element as well as a dimension here. So Americans with the most education are most worried their political views could get them fired or harm their careers. And this is the first question on the top here. Are you worried about losing your job or missing out on job opportunities if your political opinions became known? So as a postgrad, you're 44% worried. As high school or less, you're 25% worried. And this is across political spectrums. And the below in that graph, Republicans with the most education are most worried their political views could harm them at work. So you see Republicans with post-grad degrees are 60% worried, whereas Democrats with post-grad degrees are 25% worried. Now, an argument could be made that some of the worry comes from things that don't actually exist. But if there are this many people that are of this opinion, it might be time to do something about it. And part of that doing something about it is this article that I use in many of my classes. It's a fairly short article by Margaret J. Wheatley. The article is titled "Willing to be Disturbed," and it's an article that talks about how being in an echo chamber does not allow us to learn much of anything at all. In fact, that echo chamber only validates and provides confirmation bias to the things that we already believe, which prevents us from continuing to learn and continuing to be students of life. This is another article that I use in my classes, NASW Policy and Practice series, Safe Spaces and Brave Spaces, Historical Context and Recommendations for Student Affairs Professionals by Diana Ali. This concept is something that I use in class as well. When we talk about safe spaces, there's a tendency to think that in 2024, in 2025, the definition of safe spaces are spaces of complete silence, because the safest conversation you can have with someone is no conversation at all. And if that's what a safe space is, then we would have no communication whatsoever, because even if I were to ask you your name, what you like to eat, what's your gender, how tall are you, how heavy are you, all of these questions could be seen as offensive to different people. And in an effort to not offend anyone, if that is the perspective of safe spaces, then we would have no conversations at all. Even if I were to ask you, what is the origin of your name? Well, that sounds racist, right? Do you like curry? Which I do. That sounds racist. So we're ending up having no conversations at all, which is contributing to the isolation that we're feeling. There is, of course, a loneliness epidemic that we're noticing amongst all age groups. Usually we talk about younger folks when we talk about the loneliness epidemic, but more research is showing that it doesn't discriminate based on age. So part of what's contributing to this loneliness is the isolation that we feel. Well, I don't want to have a conversation with this person because I might end up accidentally offending them. That then gives way to brave spaces. A brave space is a space where we're not so much concerned about emotional safety as we are about intellectual exploration. And within these brave spaces, we don't have malicious intent. We don't intend to offend others. But in the search for information, we may allow ourselves to inadvertently offend other people in the pursuit of knowledge. So, for example, myself, you might look at my skin color and look at my face and certainly look at my name, my last name in particular, and wonder, he looks like someone who might enjoy eating curry, right? And that's a perfectly fine assumption to have. And it's also a perfectly fine question to ask in a brave space where you say, hey, Nafees, I don't mean to be offensive. Hopefully you don't have to say that out loud. But Nafees, you look like someone, do you like curry? And my answer would be, yes, I love curry. You should taste my mom's cooking. I don't care what, race or gender or culture you're from. Me being a biased person, I think everyone should at some point try my mom's curry, try my mom's cooking, and they too will be hooked. So yes, I do fit into that racial stereotype of enjoying curry and foods made with curry. Why are we afraid to ask these questions? If we were in a safe space, we would ask these questions and we would just remain curious without getting answers to our questions. So the push that we make in class here is that we shift from the concept of safe spaces where we have no conversations whatsoever, or at least conversations that are so, sterilized that you couldn't really call them deep conversations at all. And then we instead move into the space of brave spaces where, again, we don't have malicious intent. We are acting in good faith to ask questions for the purpose of getting more information. So that's that shift from safe spaces to brave spaces. And this is a course that I designed and I taught at Boise State University during my tenure there. This is titled Freedom of Thought, and this is also up on FIRE's website and Heterodox Academy's website. And this is the quick course description. There's a growing perception that education and indoctrination are synonymous with one another. This course section addresses that perception by employing the point-counterpoint teaching philosophy, which is my teaching philosophy, to explore the ethics related to the inclusion of ideological diversity. This approach encourages students to consider counterpoints to their points of view, focused not on agreement but understanding. The expectation isn't that students change who they are, but get to know who they are at a deeper level. Actively practicing our freedom of thought, we'll be covering a myriad of topics from a variety of opposing and conflicting perspectives. And a word of warning, enrolling in this course section means understanding that the classroom environment may not always be an emotionally safe space, but an intellectually brave space. Now, a quick little bit about this point-counterpoint teaching philosophy. It's fairly simple. It's the idea that you do not understand your point of view until you understand the credibility and validity of opposing and conflicting points of view. It's only when you understand that your own point of view is also flawed will you then have the ability and the capacity to notice and extrapolate the flaws in opposing and conflicting points of view. If you are of the opinion that your way of thinking is the only way of thinking and anyone who thinks differently must be stupid, guess who's really stupid? So it's just that understanding that your point of view is not the only point of view. And our goal in any class, not just this particular course, but in any class that I've taught, is that we understand different perspectives without having to agree with those perspectives. And that's why in class, I'll always ask my students, I don't care if you agree, do you understand this perspective? Okay, let's go move on to the next. I don't care if you agree, do you understand that perspective? And if the answer is yes, then we move forward. If the answer is no, then we try to dig a little bit deeper. Again, I don't care or I don't want to change students from who they are. I only want them to be more of whoever it is that they are. And so a couple of quotes here. Too often we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought, from J.F. Kennedy. And the question that I've asked in class is, how often are our opinions formed without much thought? Based on maybe our parents had a certain opinion, so we just figured, well, that's my opinion too. Maybe people that we respect greatly, maybe even media, mainstream media or even social media, because they keep saying something over and over and over again as an opinion, we just figure, well, I guess that's my opinion too because I keep hearing it. So how often are those opinions of ours formed without much thought? Then we ask the question of, what really is thinking? If everybody is thinking alike, if everyone is thinking alike, then no one is thinking. This is Benjamin Franklin. And so I'll use an example here. When we have a conversation, or if we have a conversation about food is important, debate, well, no one's going to have much to say because food is important. It's obvious that food is important. And in that case, we would be thinking alike, and thus there would be no reason to really think. Anyone who would suggest that food is not important to survival, that is, wouldn't be thinking at all. It wouldn't make sense. However, if we add a little bit of nuance here and we ask breakfast is important, now we might be thinking differently. We're not all thinking alike because some people, like myself, I find that breakfast is the least important meal of the day. I like to stay in a fat shedding phase or mindset as well in the morning, and usually the first meal I'll have is lunch, if not a little bit of an early dinner, and sometimes I'll eat one meal a day. So I find breakfast to be the least important meal of the day. Others would find breakfast to be the most important meal of the day because they want to get their metabolism started early, and they want to start feeling that energy, feeling that good feeling early in the morning. And maybe they're not as concerned with losing some fat or anything like that, so they can introduce those calories, or even if they're healthier calories, if they're going to go for a run, maybe a couple strawberries, a little bit of sugar, so this way you have that energy. But my point is that the concept that breakfast is important is something that we can actually think about, but the concept of food is important, since everyone thinks alike, there's no thinking going on. So I think what's more worthwhile to have are conversations where we don't all agree with one another, because if we all agree with one another, it turns out to be quite a boring conversation. And this brings me to this quote by Michel de Montaigne: "There is no conversation more boring than the one where everyone agrees." And so education is supposed to be fun. We've been learning our entire lives. When did it become boring? In my opinion, it became boring when we all had to agree with one another. Education used to be such that we would be able to disagree with one another and our grades wouldn't suffer because of it. We wouldn't be thought of differently because of it. We would just be thought of that, okay, so this person thinks this thing, credible, valid for their lived experiences. I can think something different, credible and valid for my lived experiences. So the ability to agree to disagree and still have respect for one another seems to be escaping, you know, our society. And if we are all having conversations where everybody agrees, I can't think of anything more boring than that. And I think if we can have more classrooms across the spectrum of grades, but also across the nation, across the world, I think more students will find education to be fun when we can disagree like that with one another. And finally, this is the concept of higher education, the perception versus reality. The perception is that education is agreement, right? People who are often on the outside looking in think that professors teach students what to think, and if they think a certain way, then they're shaped in such a way that they think in this orthodoxy sort of fashion. Whereas in reality, professors like myself, and there are many of us, we find education to be more about understanding. Professors teach students how to think for themselves. So you have this comic up here where two people are sitting on two different sides of a figure that looks like a 6 and a 9. And the statement is, just because you're right doesn't mean I'm wrong. And I think we're not taking into account the impact of perspective. I'm an immigrant to the United States. English is my fourth language. And a lot of the experiences that I've had are shaped by my history. If I were speaking with someone who has been an American who was born in America and always been an American citizen, we would be looking at the same things and have different perspectives on what we're looking at. It doesn't mean that either of us are right or wrong. I think what's important is that having the academic flexibility and the intellectual flexibility to for me to go over to their side and see things from an American citizen perspective, and for them to come over to my side temporarily, both of us temporarily, and see things from an immigrant's perspective, so this way we can really appreciate our perspectives without having to agree with them. We can disagree with one another and still understand the credibility and validity of those opposing viewpoints. And that's been my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and come back to this. And there you go. I'm happy to answer any questions or comments.
All right, that's great. Nafees, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I'd like to maybe just ask a couple of questions that came to mind. One of the things that was the genesis for our project was just this orthodoxy that exists in, or oftentimes prevails in different spaces when social workers are engaging. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on polarization. And what do you believe might be contributing to this polarization, where we've moved away from the day when, the election is over, we just had an election? How could we apply this right now so that, when the election's over, we're not trying to overturn the election, or we're not trying to deny elections, or just because our candidate didn't win that we prefer, that we just accept the outcomes of the existence of different political beliefs. How do we depolarize? Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think first the polarization happens because if you think of a pendulum, it moves fastest when it's in the middle. The push pull factors are most profound when it's in the middle. And so we're naturally inclined toward polarization because, we're naturally taught to think in this binary right versus wrong perspective. And so through our process of education, we start to wonder, okay, so these are all of the perspectives. What is the right perspective? As opposed to what are the right perspectives? And understanding what makes each perspective right in its own way. So polarization sells. very well. If I were a candidate running for office and I was running against you, I probably wouldn't be able to raise much funds by saying, Matthew Watson is a wonderful person. I've really enjoyed working with him. He and I differ on certain values and agree on other values. I still think you should vote for me because I think I would be the better candidate. And you might say the same thing. And you might say, Nafees is a solid person and you enjoyed working with him as well. He and I differ, and I think you should vote for me, Matthew Watson, because I feel like I would represent this jurisdiction, this zip code, this city, this state, this country better. That's just not going to sell. Neither of us are going to get many votes. The way that we get votes is that I say smear campaigns for you, you run smear campaigns against me, and there's this polarization. People are more willing to spend money and give up their resources to support movements that are extremely polarized themselves, and that's what sells. And I think this also speaks to, I wrote an article about, it was published in the Boston Herald, about when every election is the most important of our lives. And the idea around that is that you trigger polarization by making people think that things are more important than they are. So you talked about the election, and I'll talk about the election as well. It is not that important. Whether Trump won or Harris won, most of the things that are the way they are today will likely stay the same 4 years from now. And I don't mean to insult any candidate. I just insult both candidates in this example evenly, sure. Is that things don't change. That the bureaucracy and just how many levels there are, this is more of a macro political conversation, but there's just too many chefs in the kitchen to assume that one person, even if they are the president, even if they are considered the leader of the free world, there are still so many chefs in the kitchen that the meal isn't going to be very different for 4 years from now.
Mm. There's only so many ways to make curry,
exactly.
Is what you're saying. Okay.
My mom's is the best, though.
It sounds like you've learned from your mother, learned from experience there. Do you have anything in mind where we could talk a little bit about this paradigm of what are the right perspectives rather than the right and the wrong perspective? Do you have anything that comes to mind right off the bat?
Yes, I think, when we think about the right perspectives, when it's plural, I think we're thinking of questions. When we think of perspective, singular, we're thinking of answers. And I'm on record as saying, although this isn't something that you should do if you're married, but you sort of just work with me on this example, I think you should marry the questions and date the answers. Allow the answers to be different every now and then, as long as you stay committed to the questions, because whatever question you ask, like for example, what do you use to communicate with people in 2024? Let's say that's the question. And right now in 2024, it would be Zoom, it would be Riverside, it would be, text messages, it would be iPhone, Android. Well, 100 years ago, it would be something very different. It would be mail. It would be maybe telegraphs. I don't really know the history of all this, but eventually the telephone came into play. We would call each other. Landlines. If we were expecting a phone call, we'd have to wait by the kitchen to get that phone call. And now we're so much more connected. So if the answer is what we are marrying, and I am the person who designed the original telephone, I will go out of my way to make sure that the answer to the question of how do we communicate with one another is always the phone, because I have that invested interest, However, if we marry the question instead of the answer, and we ask how do we communicate with one another, we open the door for answers that will continue to evolve over the course of time. And pretty soon, I'm sure we're going to have, something chipped into our minds where we can telepathically communicate with one another within, I'm sure within the century, and there's conversations about it right now. So if we marry the questions, which would be the perspectives, instead of marrying the answer, which is the perspective, I think we can be more open-minded.
That's great. That's great. So let's apply that to something that is somewhat contentious right now, or has been, and that is the issue of elections themselves and voter ID and so forth. Differentiate, if you will, what, asking the, kind of this paradigm of trying to ask the right versus wrong questions or getting the right versus wrong answers, which I think is creating some contention, versus trying to ask the right questions. Mm-hmm. How would we reframe that particular issue so that we're asking questions that could facilitate social work, that could facilitate coming together and finding a solution. Do you have any thoughts on the application
I
around
do.
voter
I
ID?
do. So around voter ID, I think what I would do in the classroom is ask, let's point counterpoint this. What are some reasons to require voters to have ID in order to vote? And what are some reasons why, we shouldn't have that? Now, if one of those lists is way longer than the other side of that list, then we need to do more work because for every point, we have to assume that there is a counterpoint. So if the
Hmm.
people that say that voters should be required to have IDs, and why wouldn't you? Because you need it for to drive, to do this, to do that. That's a sound argument. Now, this same person, can you make a counter argument? And if the student says, no, I can't, then I don't know if I've done my job. And there are plenty of counterpoints as well. Well, not everyone has a car, but everyone does. Whoever's living in the United States, whether legally or illegally, is still living in the United States. And just because you live in the United States, we don't hunt you down. We don't treat you inhumanely. And if you consider voting to be a humane right, then you might say, well, voter ID and immigration status should not play a role in whether or not people are permitted to vote. Now, the goal of this
Hmm.
is not to show like what my perspective is. I'm like yourself, all of us, we've thought about this long enough where we know exactly where we stand, and we're pretty strong in where we stand. My goal is to hopefully confuse my students where they don't know where I stand at all. So this way they can consider all those viewpoints, because the last thing I want to do is be the sort of authority figure that I've had in my past, where we go through these different perspectives, and at the end, my professors will tell me theirs, and now their perspective is mine. So, in many ways, I leave listeners and viewers and students very unsatisfied with my lectures because they usually end with, it's up to you. And that doesn't rub everyone the right way, but I think that's where we need to step away and give enough information to people to make up their own minds without
Hmm.
influencing them
Hmm.
in any direction.
Gotcha. So what? But what do you do if you don't agree?
Well, that's a good question, because if I were to say you vote on it, then who votes on it, right? Because if you're saying voters need to have ID, I think in this sort of example, for there to be a winner, there has to be a loser. For there to be inclusion, there has to
Hmm.
be exclusion. And if the general consensus is that voter ID needs to be a factor to be able to vote, then that is what it is. And you take the L, those who take the L in that perspective, and you take the W if you've won that. And then, of course, on the
Hmm.
other side is that, if you've lost that argument, then, lose with grace. And I think this also speaks
Yeah.
to the larger election, the whole process of just if your candidate doesn't win, all of a sudden it's the end of the world. I think we need to get away from that and understand that, okay, so this party won, this person won, but there's still much that we can work on together. It doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It just means that this is a speed bump along the way. You don't stop driving just because there's one singular speed bump.
Great. Boy, Nafees, as we're having this conversation, I find myself asking these questions, and as soon as I ask, I'm hearing you, and then there's these little voices going on in my head that help me kind of answer these questions as well. And there's kind of this validating experience because I'm asking myself, well, what do you do if you don't agree? The obvious answer comes to my mind is, well, duh. Do you always agree with your wife? Do you always agree with your best friend? And it seems like, your response of grace is that enters in, that it's just like, you know what? Our relationship matters more than, whatever issue we're fighting about, or we're disagreeing about, or we're not even fighting. We just have differences about.
Yeah.
You matter more to me. And this is where social work, I think, it really is work, but it's really about being social.
Yeah.
It's not partisan, you versus me, left versus right, those kinds of things. It really is about us, that democracy is ultimately not you, me, it's an us. It's how do we live together in a pluralistic society? How do we, that's what it ultimately comes down to, is living together, loving together, and being social. And I really like the suggestions that you're bringing forth about questions. So
I think it's one of
yeah.
those things where we're going to experience our victories and our defeats over the course of time. And what ends up happening is that it's important to lose with grace, but it's also important to win with grace as well. Because if
Yeah.
we're having these mic drop moments, right? Let's say you defeat me in whatever it is that we're doing, and whatever it is that we're debating about, and you just drop your mic, like that's the last thing that you have to say. And then I have something else that, and I say it, and then I've won that argument, I drop my mic. What ends up happening is that neither of us are holding mics anymore, and we're not able to talk with one
Mm.
another. So these mic drop moments that are just viral sensations of just, you see on TikTok and Snapchat of people getting owned, Charlie Kirk with Turning Point USA and Candace Owens, like, yeah, these students are getting owned. That's cool. That's fun. That gets a lot of likes. But you have to understand that it's shutting down conversation when we don't win with
Yeah.
grace. We have to learn to win with grace as well.
Yeah. That's a really good point. The grace is ultimately about a relationship. Yeah, what also comes to mind here, Nafees, from a professional perspective is the acknowledgement or recognition that the relationships are generally not static. Human relationships are not static. They're not static.
Yeah.
They they're more of they're more dynamic. They're more of a state than they are a trait. A trait is something that's more fixed. A state is a circumstance or a condition. And the more we can recognize that, hey, it's vulnerable. This is a living thing.
Yeah.
We need to nourish it. We need to make sure that it operates in a broader context. And you, me, either or, that paradigm doesn't seem to be working for us globally, but more of an us pluralistic paradigm is really.
Yeah, it's this self-centered perspective of, it is a defense mechanism in that we tend to think of ourselves as dynamic beings and tend to think of everything and everyone else as static beings. It's sort of like if I were to put this water bottle in the refrigerator in a certain spot and come back to it a few hours later, I have to know that that's going to be there. But if this was a dynamic water bottle, then it might be somewhere else. And that would confuse my perception of reality. So it is a defense mechanism for us to think of ourselves as dynamic beings and others as static beings. But I think understanding our own, turning the lens into a mirror and looking at ourselves and saying, I'm just doing the defense mechanism right now. And people change.
Mm,
Look at the voting patterns as well. Look at who won the popular vote versus who was thought to be the worst person ever back in 2020, back in 2016. So, people change. And if you look on social media, there's a lot of influential people that are constantly changing sides. And I think this is another part of winning and losing with grace is that if you don't win with grace, you make it less of an opening for others to understand and come to your side as well. If you're
mm,
graceful in that, you open the door for people to be dynamic enough to be as dynamic as we know ourselves internally to be.
mm. Yeah, yeah. And that dynamic nature, I'm just thinking about that. If you see, culture, society, relationships, micro, macro, as dynamic, changing, evolving organisms, it does impact how we influence each other and see each other as people rather than as objects or even worse, trash or you know really negative pejorative labels. Let's bring this back to our work as social workers and our own experiences with orthodoxy or with kind of you have to believe one way or you have to be one way in order to, or you have to vote one way. How does this apply? How does what you've described, not just in higher education, but how does this apply to social work?
Yeah.
How, and can you share some examples of where you've seen orthodoxy prevail, but also where you've seen heterodoxy or or pluralism or grace
Yeah,
prevail?
so social work is about meeting the client where they're at. And it would appear as though it's meeting the client where they're at in every way possible except ideological and political diversity from a political perspective. So I've seen people talk about, and especially lately, therapists on social media talking about how if they know that their patients and their clients voted a certain way, that they would somehow alter their services to be less effective. Essentially, that's very much against social work principles. But if people are so open about it and so willing to communicate about it, they don't fear any repercussions. It tells you that society is okay with that perspective. And so, from this orthodoxy not being successful, that's a great example of that, because we take essentially an oath to do what's best for people based on what they believe to be best for themselves. And yet here we are saying, well, if you voted for someone that I don't agree with, then I'm not going to help you do what I said that I would help you to do. And so, if we're going to meet people where they're at, we have to do that in every way. And of course, on the other side, and there's a good counterpoint here, is that, well, if there are people that think that those on the other side are just the worst sorts of people, evil, and all the names that you can think of,
Right, right.
then yeah, like, there would be justification to not help people, because they might say, well, helping the people who are evil would give way to more people who are evil. So when you notice evil, you just shut it down right away, so the evil doesn't move forward. I think it's a matter of understanding all these different perspectives, and also acknowledging that our own bias coming into it. When we say someone or something is evil, how much of that is actually true versus how much of that is what we think to be true? Generally,
Mm.
we have a lot of difficulty, and it doesn't matter what level of education or practice experience we have a lot of difficulty separating facts from our opinions. Or it's easy to do when it's facts and other people's opinions, but we tend to
Hmm.
have a lot of difficulty in differentiating between what are facts and what are our own opinions. So once we're able to separate that and understand that, I think we can be better practitioners. But it can be really detrimental in a practice sense if that sort of orthodoxy is practiced, unless the clients and the patients, are of the same ideology and political perspective as those clinicians. In which case, you might find those clinicians to be even more inspired. Well, they voted like me, and I voted the same way, so I'm going to go to bat for you. I'm going to go well above and beyond what my job description says. You wouldn't do that for someone who didn't vote the same way that you did? Well, some people would benefit from that, other people wouldn't.
Interesting. Yeah. So as we think about differentiating facts and opinions or beliefs or values, the ability for there to have diversity. Without diversity, you really don't have any option. You don't have, choice. You just, it doesn't. You can't deny kind of facts, if you will. But that said, you know, can you also make space for those who believe it to be a fact that everything is a social construct, and that's their fact, that's their belief, and can we accommodate people or can we accommodate, well, in a pluralistic society, these different ways of viewing? I treat certain beliefs in my life as factual for me, but I acknowledge that those are not necessarily facts for others. And so because I treat them as facts, my tenets of my values, my beliefs, my faith, if I don't treat them as facts, or maybe not facts, but if I don't create the same level of priority for them as, say, we would facts, our commitments to our beliefs, our tenet, our faith and so forth may not necessarily be as strong as one might want them to be. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to believe what I
Yeah.
believe. I think we have to put that into a broader context, that there has to be room for differences. There has to be room for diversity. There has to be room for opposition in all
Yeah.
things, if you will. Because if there is no opposition, there's no, it's you're no longer engaging in social work if there
Yeah.
isn't diversity, if there isn't an opposition.
That's true. And, for those who believe that everything is a social construct, then they would be essentially forced to believe that the idea that everything is a social construct is also a social construct.
Oh, good
So,
point.
and then
Okay.
not that that argument would then fall apart, but for those folks, that might be the way of starting the conversation that people out there might also exist who don't believe that everything is a social construct. So
Yeah.
if everything is a social construct, then all of a sudden nothing is a social construct. We get into different deontological, teleological conversations. But what you mentioned about diversity is that, you know, the impression shouldn't be that, diversity should just be superficial. You and I look very different from one another, but that's not the most meaningful style of diversity. I would think that, this is the
Mhm.
color of skin diversity that we have, the superficial areas of diversity. But what really makes this conversation riveting and the conversations that we continue to have so riveting is that we have a diversity of thought. You and I think differently on
Mm.
certain things and similarly on other things. And that's what makes, this friendship worth continuing forward with. If you and I thought the
You
same
bet.
kind of way, I wouldn't learn anything
Right.
from you, you wouldn't learn anything from me, and there would just be no point of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've had other conversations on our podcast with people who have different beliefs, who suggest that we should embrace, a particular ideology, and others who say no, that there needs to be room for some diversity. I really like the emphasis that you made on, part of social work practice is joining people where they are, and context is sometimes at the heart of social work. We're all experience dependent in our maturation, and so we've all had, even identical twins have different, evolve differently or develop differently because they don't always have the same experiences. But there are some things in common. I have the Code of Ethics open and just references to context. It says a historic and defining feature of social work is the profession's dual focus on individual well-being in a social context
Yeah.
and the well-being of society. So you got the individual and the society, person and environment, but social context matters, joining them where they are. Talking about self-determination, let's see. In terms of violations of the code of ethics and so forth, it doesn't necessarily imply legal liability or violation of law. Such determination can only be made in the context of legal and judicial proceedings. So we're not suggesting that our ethics are legally binding, but they're binding in terms of our work as a social worker. We may not be sued for that, but we could lose our license if we're out of context. Yeah. The code offers a set of values, principles, and standards to guide decision making in contact when ethical issues arise. It does not provide a set of rules that prescribe how social workers should act in all situations.
Exactly. So the code of ethics are there, but that statement tells us that the application of the code of ethics can be fairly subjective.
Exactly. The specific applications must take into account the context in which it is being considered and the possibility of conflicts among the code's values, principles, and standards. And that the code does not privilege any one of the 6 values above the other. That service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, competence, integrity, all of those things are important, but there's sometimes a dialectic or a competing tension between, those things. And so we can't always just privilege one over the other. We have to acknowledge, again, context and starting where people are at. The other thing that I thought was interesting is, hang on just a second, is it talks about, if we meet people where the client, or if we meet the client where they're at, the code also references that who is the client in social work? Well, it could be an individual. It could be a relationship, family relationship sometimes. It could be a community. It could be the broader culture. And I like to see pro-social workers, I like to define it as social work for social workers. That we're dialoguing across differences, that we're humanizing differences, that we humanize people rather than demonize them or humanize their perspective, again, considering context rather than demonizing and so forth. I think that's critical. I think that's really, really important. But it has to function in the context of the Code of Ethics. This isn't a free-for-all where social work is just, hey, I'm going to do what I think is helpful to someone. No, that there is an ethical framework for us in which we practice. So, any thoughts on that? I just kind of rambled there for a bit.
And it's important to acknowledge that that ethical framework does include political diversity, political beliefs, and religion and many other categories. So I think in good faith, some social workers, some practitioners might not know that there is room for that area of viewpoint diversity within the Code of Ethics. And in bad faith, the worst case scenario would be where there are social workers that know that there is that leeway, but choose not to prioritize that perspective, that viewpoint diversity perspective, and just take into account all other areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ignore viewpoint diversity, viewpoint equity, and viewpoint inclusion. So we can't go into their minds and know exactly what they're thinking. And I'm always of the opinion that we should assume good, and if then our minds are changed, then our minds are changed, but always assume good. And many of us, maybe we don't have time to just dissect the NASW Code of Ethics the way that you and I have, and show that, yes, there is room for conservatives in the field of social work. And it's fairly obvious that it's already written in to the NASW Code of Ethics in many, many areas. You just have to do a quick little highlight job, and there you have it. Not all of us have that amount of time. And we might be working with clients, we might have our own personal lives and personal things to do. And we think to ourselves, well, my boss tells me what to do, and this is what I did, and it pays the bills. So I'm just, I'm a social worker. I feel like I'm doing good work. My life has meaning. That's it. I don't need to dissect the Code of Ethics and know exactly the whole history of where I'm from. That's perfectly fine. And I think what I really worry about are the people that have done their homework, that do have that time and know that there's room for viewpoint diversity, but intentionally choose not to acknowledge that area of diversity. That's who I really worry about.
Interesting. Nafees, taking a positive, believing in the best in people, that's a fairly pro-social approach. As we wind things down here, I would invite you to share your thoughts on what does it mean to you. What does it mean to you to be pro-social?
To me, it means that we create an inclusive environment for all different viewpoints. Now, it is a given that not every perspective has as much credibility and validity. Like, for example, if someone believes that the earth is flat, then, it's not. But, all ideas should be welcome in a space. And then we work it out through conversation. We don't go into a space assuming that these are the right answers and those are the wrong answers. Acting in good faith, acting in this pro-social sort of good faith manner means that every conversation we have with people, both professionally but hopefully also personally, we give people the benefit of the doubt and we assume that they mean well and they are right. And then through different conversations and dialogue, we can then figure out what is right, what is wrong, what are questions, what are answers, what are opinions, what are facts. I think really giving people that good faith leeway and assuming the best at the start of every conversation rather than assuming the worst, I think that's what being pro-social means.
Interesting. Thank you. Nafees, that's wonderful. Assuming the best, assuming good, assuming that this is a conversation, there's some interaction rather than just one-way experience. Thank you very much. This has been wonderful. Just aligns very well with our three guiding principles of humanizing, people with differences, dialoguing across those differences, and standing for ethical principles.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Nafees. This has been wonderful. I appreciate your time and your effort, and we'll look forward to future interactions.
Thank you for having me. This is a true honor. I really appreciate it, and I hope to do a lot more work together in the future.
I certainly hope so as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the ProSocial Workers podcast. We're grateful to our guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for being part of this journey. If you'd like to earn continuing education credits, don't forget to visit our website at prosocialworkers.com, where you can register, pay a fee, complete a course evaluation, and take a quick quiz. We look forward to having you with us next time as we continue to explore how we can put the social back into social work.